You're listening to the Healthy Creative Ministry podcast with Matt Curtis. This is the podcast that helps you take your creative ministry from wherever you are today to healthy and effective.
Have you ever wondered why church communications feels so lonely? I don't know if you felt that way in the midst of your day-to-day serving your church in the role of communications, but I know for me, that was a real challenge for most of my career. I felt like nobody really understood what I was doing. It felt like I was kind of alone and stranded on an island. In some cases, it felt like it was me versus the ministry leaders. And it was that way for many years. And a part of that was because I was expecting the wrong person to solve the problem. I expected leadership to solve it, or I expected the ministry leaders to solve it. But actually, it was my problem to solve. And it took me a long time to get there. And my hope is that this conversation today will help you get there faster so that you don't have to endure this for a long time in your ministry. In fact, there are plenty of people that I've talked to that this has gotten to be such a challenge that it's led to them leaving ministry. I don't want that for you. The church needs creatives in the trenches partnering with ministry leaders to help communicate effectively, to help communicate clearly, to help communicate with integrity. That's a piece of what you bring to the table, so much more, but you help your church do those things. And so let's have this conversation about loneliness. Why is it that we feel so lonely in our role as church communicators? There are three things I want to call out, and then don't worry, there's a recommendation here at the end in terms of what I have seen to be the key to solving this problem. This isn't a let's acknowledge it and tolerate it. No, let's acknowledge it for the purpose of then moving past it. Let's build the solution to this problem. There are three reasons that I personally felt really lonely in ministry. The first was that I was just so busy all the time. It felt like I was always being asked for more, whether it be me as a sole executor or me when I was leading my creative team. It felt like the ministry leader's job was to continually outpace our capacity. So that meant we had to get creative, meant that we had to work late, meant that we had to work through lunch, which is a bit of why Lunchtime Heroes is named Lunchtime Heroes. As soon as your work starts eking into your lunch hour, there's an issue. It's time to have a conversation about, okay, what's going on here that is causing me to not be able to have this balance in my life where I can't even take my lunch? And so that was a big part of my life. I was so busy all the time. I was always being asked for more. And what that did for me is it made the relationships with my coworkers really, really tricky, because I would see somebody and say, oh, hey, how's it going? How was your weekend? How's the family? How are the kids? And I knew that it would sort of evolve into a conversation. Oh, hey, since I got you here, I'd love to ask you for something. I would love to fill out another request for you verbally without going through the proper channels. I don't want to follow your systems. I want to just, tell you here in the hallway. And so in some cases, I found myself, especially on weekends, on Sunday morning, walking into church, and I would see my coworkers. These are my ministry partners. These are the people that I'm doing ministry alongside. We're all on the same team. We're all working for the same mission. And I wouldn't really want to say hi to them because I was worried that it would turn my Sunday into a work day and I would be having more requests coming in. And I'm just like, I got to just check out. Like, I need a break from all of this. And so the busyness is a real challenge when it comes to contributing to our loneliness. We feel like we don't have time to have meaningful relationships. There's a really clear era shift for me. We were a regional church, meaning one location served a large area in our kind of region. And we moved to a multi-site model. And the idea really was that the location closer to you is a better location for you to attend. So we were really kind of pushing the proximity was the solution. And I remember we became so busy as an organization that we didn't have time to have kind of chit-chat conversations at work anymore. We were always doing things. And I could feel the disconnect from relationships to transactions. And that was a really, really hard shift for me. But it also was a very clear revelation for me that the amount of work that we're doing is a really significant contributor as to why we feel lonely in what we do. And so if your workload is really kind of beyond your capacity, that's going to contribute to loneliness. It's going to make your relationships more transactional, whether that be because everybody's just coming and asking or because you don't feel like you have the time to engage. I was there. I didn't feel like I had the time to have a meaningful conversation with anybody. Look, I got too much on my plate right now, all right? Can you just shoot me an email and let's be done with this? Look, I'm just trying to get to the other side of the office to have a meeting with somebody. Can we not have this conversation right now? I just don't have time for this. And so I was, in a way, contributing to my own loneliness by trying to survive. So busyness. Busyness is a real significant piece as to why we feel lonely much of the time. The second reason that I have found is that not a lot of people understand how creativity works. There is a very clear system and process that stimulates creativity and that in some cases kind of protects creativity. I remember being in a meeting. We were planning Christmas Eve services, which were a big deal at the church that I was serving at that time. We were planning. It was kind of the early brainstorming sessions, where nothing's off base. Like, yeah, let's do this. Let's do this. All these kind of wild ideas were being thrown out. And it was clear that we were moving in a certain direction. It was very complicated. It had a lot of moving parts. And in some cases, there were conditions that were outside of our control. There was a little bit kind of having to do with weather. We needed a clear sky for kind of the thing that was being envisioned. And I just remember there was a lot of pushback, a lot of challenge to just the logistics of it. And the worship guy was sitting next to me and he leaned over and he said, you know how it is. Like, I'm just going to be inspired at the last minute and I'm going to have a creative idea. And that's just how creativity works. And I looked over at him and I said, no, that is not how creativity works. I said, tell me this. If you ask me to promote an event for you and I come to you the day we're supposed to promote it and say, just idea didn't strike me, nothing really kind of came to mind and inspired me. Would you be satisfied with my result? Of course not. I'd probably lose my job at some point if that was my pattern. Sorry, I'm not delivering on any of the deadlines that I have. I just haven't felt it. That's not how creativity works at all. But that's the perception people have of how creativity works. And so what needs to change here is other people need to understand how creativity works. When they don't, when they just think that you kind of go into your office or cubicle or open up your computer and kind of press a couple buttons and all of a sudden, boom, you did it. That's not how the process works at all. And when we have those conversations, we feel on the outside. We feel a little bit more lonely, a little bit more isolated, a little bit more like, man, nobody gets me. Being understood is a big part of why we feel lonely in church communications, because other people don't get us. They don't understand what we go through and what we do in order for us to get the job done. Now, I want to call this out a little bit here. They shouldn't understand that. And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about in a second here. But just the fact that they don't understand how creativity works is a real contributor to why we feel lonely. We feel like we don't belong. We feel like we're not on the same team. We feel like we're an adversary in some cases. We're pushing for an idea and other people just aren't bought into it. There are a lot of seasons where that was the case for me. Felt like I was sort of on the other team fighting against the rest of the team. But ultimately, no one else should understand how creativity works. And that's the last one I want to lean into here. We feel like we can't operate at our potential. So we feel busy. We are busy all the time. We have a lot of stuff going on. We feel like nobody understands how creativity works. They don't understand what we do or what it takes for us to get the job done. And then the final one, we feel like we can't operate at our full potential. We see opportunities. We see things that could be happening, but they can't happen because there's always resistance. There's always somebody who just doesn't kind of understand where we're coming from. They don't really get the vision behind it. In some cases, we don't have time, kind of alluding back to the first one here. We don't have time to pull it off. This would be a great solution. We just don't have time to pull it off. I see this a lot with social media. Man, I have a vision for what social media could be for our church. but I don't have time to pull this off. And that's a real challenge. That's a real part of the issue that we face in communications, and especially when we're serving in a church that is kind of growing, that is sort of pushing the limits on our internal support, our ability for our staff to support what's happening in the ministry. We see so much more potential than we can realize. And so this, again, pushes us into this really, really kind of a frustrated and lonely place. We're the only one who sees the vision. Every conversation is an argument or a bit of me trying to convince you, look, this is going to be a good idea. We spend more time arguing for the idea than we do implementing ideas. That was my life for a season of my career, and it was exhausting. And it really did make me feel like nobody else was on my team. Like I was pursuing a different mission than everyone else. Or worse, I'm pursuing the mission of the church, but I'm doing it with a zeal that nobody else has. I'm willing to work like nobody else is. Those are some of the really difficult and isolating beliefs that were creeping into my mind because I was constantly trying to fight these fights and win these battles. And it all came back to the fact that I saw potential that others didn't. I felt like we weren't able to operate at our full potential. So those are the three things I've seen and kind of felt deeply that contributed to my own isolation. What I did not realize, and this is the life of of a church communications person. Often, we're going down the road for a long period of time, struggling with these struggles, and it's only toward the end that we realize, oh, there was a fix for these things. I just thought this was how the industry worked. I thought this is how, broken church communications was. Nope. Actually, there's a really powerful and effective solution to this. And the belief that I had wrong, the false belief that I held on to early in my career, was that it would come from someone else. It would come from ministry leaders. It would come from church leadership. The senior pastor would come in and say, hey, Matt, here's a framework for effective balance in your ministry. It didn't happen. I had to solve these problems over time. But they all came back to the same thing. The reality here is that it was my job to build the structure of communications. If you serve in church communications, it's your job as well. That's a piece of what we're bringing to the table in our role. We need to build the structures that govern the chaos of communications and ministry together. We can, it's super doable, but it's our responsibility to build those things. There are a couple areas where I've seen that to be necessary, and we're going to go through those. So this is really kind of kicking off the next sort of season of content here with the podcast to dig into each of these areas and really kind of talk about what their role is, why they matter, why we can do this, how we can do this. That's what we're, really kind of leaning into here. And it parallels with the course that I have on my website, lunchtimeheroes.co. Click on courses, and it really kind of follows that that structure that the course goes through. But I'm also going to be going a little bit deeper in the sense that this is a little bit more conversational, so this isn't just kind of the content in the workbook and the content in the course, segment, but I want to talk a little bit more broadly about these things in terms of how we bring them to the table and why they're so important for us, because it matters a lot that we understand that. So the areas where I have found structure is really critical. We need a communications channel audit. We need to have a reason as to why we are saying what we're saying, where we're saying it. So the audit helps us call out where. Where are we communicating things? Are we communicating things on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on LinkedIn? I mean, where are you putting your content? That's what we want to understand there with the audit. We also need to have a promotional plan. We need to understand in advance what's being communicated where, when, why, how, like what does this package look like? If you have an event, this is what you get. We can't always be reactionary in the work that we're doing. So the tension that I ran into for many years was that my communications reality was I sit at my desk and wait until somebody comes and tells me what to do. at the last minute usually. And that's just not going to be effective as you grow, as you become more complicated. I think that's something that's interesting to call out here. Growth isn't always just numbers. Sometimes your growth is in complexity. Sometimes your organization just becomes dramatically more complicated. That's what happened for us when we went to multi-site. We didn't really grow numerically. In fact, we shrunk a little bit, but our complexity was through the roof. Everything was more complicated by a significant amount. And so these systems and these processes aren't just to help you grow numerically. They do that. This type of an approach helps you really make these processes function extremely well so that you can handle growth. But it also positions you to be able to handle complexity. And so promotional plan. Decide in advance. Know what promotions get what. Know that stuff ahead of time. That's going to simplify a lot of your life. And then project management, of course, if you have projects coming in, you need to build a system that allows you to get those done reliably, consistently, on time. You got to be delivering on the projects that are coming in, and a project management, approach or philosophy or, whatever, the tools you use, the strategy, the structure, all that stuff contributes to doing that. And then you want to create clear, repeatable workflows. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time on every project. And again, we're going to go into the details of what these things mean, the value behind them, and some tips or strategies in terms of how you can pull these off yourself. But the overarching principle here is that I think a lot of times why we're lonely in church communications is because we don't have the systems to support the work that we're doing. We're innovating and reinventing on every project, as opposed to saying, we have a system and a process for 90% of what we do in our organization when it comes to communications. And then we can navigate the 10% that doesn't fit with that, or the 20%, depending on the culture that you're at. Early in my career, I was working in an environment where we were probably 80% last minute projects and 20% planned ahead. And it was brutal. I mean, brutal. Because what would happen is you wanted to favor the planned out projects, but because there was so much chaos, you couldn't. The planned projects almost became harder to navigate because you knew about them, you wanted to invest in them, but you couldn't because a last minute project crept in there and just wreaked havoc on what it is you were trying to accomplish. So this idea of building structures and processes is going to be the thing that helps protect creativity in your communications ministry. It's going to be the thing that frees you to be able to be creative. I know a lot of times, at least for me, I had a lot of pushback against systems early in my career. I've realized that those systems are the key to me being reliably, consistently, and repeatably creative in ministry. And also, and relevant to today's conversation about loneliness, what this structure did for me is it changed the dynamic of my relationships with the people I was serving. It was no longer somebody coming to me trying to convince me to do something for them. It was no longer someone trying to leverage our friendship for the purpose of getting something special or something above and beyond for promoting their ministry. Everything was already laid out. Everyone knew how the operation functioned. Everyone knew the systems, the processes. They knew the promotional plan. They knew that having an event like this would get them promotion like that. All of those things were off the table now in terms of a conversation or a negotiation. And instead, we could just be friends. We could just hang out. We could just spend time and get to know how our families are doing. And that completely changed how lonely I felt when it came to being on staff. And so those steps are going to be so critical, not just for the success of your communications ministry, not just for the potential impact. All of those things are great, and there's no issue there. But I really care deeply about the individuals. I care about you who is on a comm team. You're struggling. As a person, you're having a hard time. That's where I found myself for so many years. And it's a really difficult place to be. And I'm really thankful to have gone through those seasons myself because I've learned so much about how systems can help prevent that. And of course, through Lunchtime Heroes, trying to help that be as adopted by as many churches as possible. But I really do want you to love what you're doing. And these systems can be a mechanism that frees you to be able to use the gifts and the skills that God has given you to really lean in and help the church, serve the church, move the mission forward in the church that you're serving at. That's my dream. That's my dream for you, for every creative, really serving on a church staff. And systems like these are the key to get you there. So consider implementing some of these things. Spend some time thinking about this idea of, what are some of the systems, or what are some of the areas where there is chaos right now? Or what are some of the areas where that disruptive stuff, those hard conversations or those negotiations, they're actually making me feel a little bit more lonely and more isolated as a communications person. Think about where those might be in your ministry. And then over the next, few weeks, as we dig into some of these topics, think about how these solutions might be able to play out well for you. If you recognize like this is a problem, we got to solve it, give me a call. shoot me a message. You can find, do a let's chat at the bottom of my website, lunchtimeheroes.co. Would love to connect with you and talk about what that could look like. There are a handful of ways that I have found to be very successful for people to make these changes. It can look like one-on-one coaching. It can look like a designed, let's build your comm team together or your comm ministry together. It could be joining the Christian Creative Group where we have these conversations regularly. There's a lot of ways that you can find the support that would be beneficial to you to build this. And so I want you to know that I am here. I'm here to help. That's what my business exists to be. And would love to have that conversation if you feel like that's something that would be helpful. When you have the right systems in place, it changes the nature of how you partner with others. You shift from doing it for them to doing it with them. And when you do that, you'll not feel alone anymore.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Healthy Creative Ministry Podcast. This podcast is just one of the ways Lunchtime Heroes can help you build a healthy creative ministry in your church. Stay up to date on the latest by signing up for the Creative Bites email at lunchtimeheroes.co.